Hey everybody, what's going on? This is Dean Meadows for another edition of Dean's Dialogue in association with the Daily Apologist. And as you can probably tell, I'm a little bit under the weather, but I wouldn't miss this podcast for just about anything. We've got an exciting topic today, a really cool guest that I deeply admire. But before we get to that, it's time for the shameless plugs, also known as, hey, this is what's going on here recently at the Daily Apologist. And what's really cool is because of the work of Jack Lipsey, who is our video and audio director here at the Daily Apologist, Dean's Dialogue is now registered on iTunes. So you don't have to go to SoundCloud anymore. You can if you want, but it's available on iTunes. So go ahead, check that out, subscribe to it, listen to it, and give me feedback. You can email me at djmeadows87@gmail with any suggestions or topics or questions that you have that I can answer on the podcast. Also, today is another landmark day for the Daily Apologist. We have been around for about 6 months, and we just got our 1,400th follower. So kudos to you guys out there who support the Daily Apologist, whether it's with devouring our content, sharing our content, watching our videos, your prayers, your monetary donations, all of that stuff allows us to do what we love to do, and that's equip Christians to engage culture. So thank you so much from the bottom of my heart and from the team's heart. We greatly appreciate you guys, and we hope that God continues to bless you and continues to bless the work at the Daily Apologist. Also, be advised, if you go to the Lake Norman Church of Christ website, that's lakenormanchurchofchrist.org, you can catch the seminar that I did a couple of weeks ago there, and would love your feedback on that too, or any questions that you have there as well. That's lakenormanchurchofchrist.org. So let's go ahead and get into the show. Today we are going to talk about the Jesus mythicist movement. And because I know relatively little about that, I know enough to do some damage, but my guest today is Dr. Dewayne Bryant. Doc, what's going on?
Oh, not too much, man. How are you?
I'm doing great. So for all of the people who are listening here, just go ahead and take a couple minutes and give us your background, both your spiritual background and also your academic background.
Okay. Well, as far as my academic background goes, it's pretty varied. I took a pretty winding route through history, biblical studies, archaeology, and back into biblical studies. So finished a couple of master's degrees, PhD. So I've spent quite a while getting equipped for this kind of thing. It's as far as my spiritual background goes, I've been a Christian for most of my life, and this topic today is one that really kind of hits home with me because of my love of ancient mythology. And so that's something that's always fascinated me, and it's really a big reason why I'm so interested in it.
Outstanding. So that leads me to my first question for you. What is the Jesus mythicist movement, and really why should Christians care about this topic?
Well, the mythicist position is one that states that Jesus was not a real historical figure. He's basically plagiarized from ancient religions. Early Christians drew from a variety of religious sources in putting together this figure of Christ, and it's drawn from any number of different religions, and so it kind of has this monolithic view of this divine Savior God who came to earth, died for the sins of humanity, was crucified, and then rose after 3 days in the grave. And so it's a kind of a template where they will identify similar features as what we find in the gospel stories in any number of different religious or mythological traditions, from ancient Egypt to Greece to Rome and elsewhere. And the reason why it's important for us as Christians today to understand it is because it is something that gets a lot of traction on a popular level. It's easy to spread. I've seen memes all over Facebook depicting Jesus in the same way as any other god, or describing other deities in language that is really kind of distinctively Christian, but instead of having Christ, it's the name of this other deity. And so for some people, I think it's somewhat confusing, but for a lot of folks, it sounds persuasive. And so it really is posing a spiritual danger to people because it is very uncritically passed off as absolutely legitimate, whether it's on a blog or a meme on Facebook, or Bill Maher had a documentary that came out several years ago called Religulous, and that was part of the documentary. It's just simply a feature of our world that this is taken for granted by some people.
So that leads to another question that I have. Obviously Bill Maher has really reestablished himself, I think, personally, off that documentary. What are some other popular level works or movies or documentaries that you know of that have kind of pushed this movement into the forefront of culture to where now it's, like you said, commonplace to kind of view Jesus as, just another god like Zeus or any of the pantheon of gods that have been mentioned or known?
Yeah, this is the thing. It's so easy to put this information into a visual format that it's been done several times. And so you've got Religulous, you've got Zeitgeist the movie by Peter Joseph. You've got a fellow by the name of Brian Fleming who put out The God Who Wasn't There. And so all of these really kind of center on this mythicist idea, but there's all kinds of other sources where you can find this. Richard Carrier, who is a historian and pretty rabid anti-theist, has done a lot of this as well. And then there's a lady, she's deceased now, but her name is Dorothy Murdoch. She made a quite a following with this. She has a website, or had a website, called Truth Be Known. It's still in operation, and this is just her bread and butter, this mythicist idea. So there's a lot of places out there where you can go. I mean, just Google, Christ myth, and you'll find it everywhere.
So it's not just on the popular level with movies; it's also in the academic level as well, academic scene as well.
Some Murdoch and Carrier really aren't terribly well qualified to speak on this issue, but they will portray themselves as scholars. And Murdoch was especially bad about this. But in truth, when it comes to the academy, very few, if anyone, actually buys into this who are genuine, legitimate scholars. It's more along the lines of pseudo-scholarship, but for the popular level person, whether they're in the pew or on the street, it has this veneer of scholarship that seems persuasive.
It's so for the average person, it's hard to distinguish between the pseudo scholarship and the actual scholarship.
Absolutely, yes.
Gotcha. So that brings to my mind another question. You have laid out what the Jesus myth is, why Christians should care about this. So, in your experience in dealing with this on a popular level, but also an academic level, what are some of the common parallels or parallel gods that are used to support the mythicist argument? So if I was a mythicist, hypothetically, what would I use to try and show you that Jesus is just some type of copycat god?
This is where it gets really interesting, because when you go to the actual myths themselves, they don't support the Christ myth theory. What you find is the simple parroting or repeating of these basic facts that are supposed to be true. And some of the popular ones that we would say are often used, one would be Krishna, the Hindu god Krishna, who was supposedly crucified and then resurrected after 3 days. If you actually go to the Hindu myths, he was shot in the foot by an arrow by a hunter, and his spirit left his body on the spot. So is there a death? Yes. Is there some kind of existence of the person's spirit beyond the death? Yes. But it's not crucifixion or resurrection after 3 days. That's one example. You've got other examples of so-called crucified gods, and some of them don't even die. And so, you've got like Hermes and Horus and Mithras. Mithras is a very, very popular one. None of them are crucified. None of them die. so they can't be crucified gods. Mithras, especially, is popular because he is also claimed to have had a virgin birth. And what we actually see with the Mithraic myths, the stories, is there's virtually nothing available to us in terms of literature that's been left behind, and very little that's been left as far as inscriptions go. But what's clear is that he's born out of a rock. And so one of the features of this Christ myth theory is they are not very specific. It's kind of like they blur the lines between a supernatural birth and a virgin birth and just call it all virgin birth, even though there's no virgin involved. Like Mithras, he's born out of a rock. There's no actual human being involved in that, or female involved, but it's labeled as a virgin birth. And so one of the problems with the Christ myth theory and its proponents is they will actually kind of blur the lines through the use of what I would call inaccurate descriptions.
So two of the popular ones that come to my mind that I hear would be Osiris. There's the myth of Osiris where supposedly Osiris is killed and then he's raised from the dead. I mean, I don't know all the specifics about the Osiris myth. So would you speak to that a little bit? Because that's probably one of the ones where our listeners, specifically the younger generation, they either have come in contact with that or they will come in contact with that type of parallel. So is there any significant parallels between Osiris and Jesus that would cause us to say they probably copied from Osiris?
Osiris is one of the ones that's closer. It's closer because there is some kind of like revivification or resurrection of Osiris. Now he is killed by his brother Set. His brother puts him in a box, drowns him in the Nile. And of course Osiris is another one of these so-called crucified gods, but you can't find crucifixion in the Egyptian myths. He's drowned in the Nile. His wife recovers the body, but then Set again takes the body, dismembers it, and scatters it throughout Egypt. The most popular version, the lengthiest version we have, is actually a Greek version that dates to just a couple of centuries before Christ. The original Egyptian myths are very piecemeal, but Osiris is revived by Isis. So there is some kind of bringing back to life, but the question is, what kind of life is that? Because Osiris, before his death in the myths, is a king. After his death, he's the lord of the underworld. So he never really returns to the land of the living. He stays as the lord of the dead. And so that's really tough, because when you look at the New Testament, it's very clear that after Christ is raised, he is the Lord of life. He is the Lord of glory. He has a new glorified body, a glorified life. And according to Paul in 1 Corinthians 15, it's kind of a prototype of what Christians will enjoy after their resurrection. Mm-hmm. And so it's really hard to maintain those connections, because one stays as the Lord of the dead, whereas Christ is the Lord of the living.
It seems like when you really look into these myths and try to draw the parallel to Jesus, it seems like you've got to work really hard to get there.
Exactly.
And so I'm going to go ahead and assume the same thing is true about Apollonius. I'm saying that right, correct? Apollonius. I've heard that before, but I don't know anything about it. I probably know more about Mithras and Osiris and Horus and all those. I know very little about Apollonius, but it seems like the more I follow Twitter, where both Christians and non-Christians follow Facebook, some Facebook groups, it seems like Apollonius is right there either behind Osiris or he's just in front of Osiris in referencing this type of parallel to Jesus is kind of the mythicist argument. So who is Apollonius? What's the big deal about Apollonius? And is there really a significant parallel between Apollonius and Jesus that would cause us to draw the conclusion that most likely the New Testament copies that story?
Well, the story of Apollonius of Tyana is interesting because in some ways it does parallel Jesus. He and Jesus very, very briefly, their lives do overlap. Jesus dies in the early 30s AD. Apollonius is born around 15 AD. So very, very briefly, their lives do overlap for about a decade and a half. But as far as the sources for his life, the main story for his life is Philostratus, the elder. And he's in the late second, early third century. So we're talking quite a bit later. And he is commissioned to write the biography of Apollonius by Empress Julia Domna. And so what seems to be the case, she was not a Christian, did not like Christians. And so what seems to be the case, one interpretation is she actually had the biography of Apollonius commissioned because she liked Apollonius. There were members of the Roman royalty who did follow him and follow his teachings. So he was a popular guy, popular teacher. But she may have commissioned that biography to serve as a competitor to the Gospels, because the Gospels do predate the biography of Apollonius. And so if there's any borrowing or any parallels to be had, it seems like it would have been the later source borrowing from the earlier source, because obviously it can't go the other direction.
Yeah, you can't borrow from what doesn't exist.
Exactly right, yes. And the Gospels were written before Apollonius' life was even over.
So where do you think the mythicist movement is, and where do you think it's headed with regards to popular level stuff and the academic realm?
As far as the academic realm, I'll do that one first. I don't think it's going anywhere because I think you have guys like Bart Ehrman, who is certainly no friend of Christians. He's no friend of Christianity. And a few years ago, he wrote a book on Jesus, defending the historical Jesus. And what's fascinating is some of these writers came out and they were fellow unbelievers, and they were savage in their response to Bart Ehrman, who is a fairly well accomplished scholar. If I'm not mistaken, he actually holds or has held a chair at SBL, the Society for Biblical Literature, and that's a very prestigious group of scholars. And so Bart Ehrman knows his stuff. He's a text critical expert. But as far as the academic aspect of it, I could only name maybe 2 PhDs in the world who buy into the Christ myth theory. One is Carrier, another is a guy named Robert Price, who is a former Baptist minister, and seems to have kind of thrown everything out when he left his faith. But as far as the popular level goes, it'll be around forever. It provides enough of a challenge to Christianity, and proponents of it do give it the veneer of scholarship. But if you really dig in, and I think most people on the popular level wouldn't really go check all their sources, mm-hmm. they never refer to the original myths. That's one thing that you find that's to me is just a catastrophic problem for the Christ myth theory, is that they don't refer to the original myths. What they do is they refer to the writings of other mythicists. And so it winds up being a very circular kind of argument when all you're doing is appealing to other people who believe your same point of view, and you're not actually looking at the evidence. So on the popular level, I mean, it'll be around, for good, because there will always be someone who, at the very least, wants to believe it, who doesn't like Christianity and will reject Christianity and any explanation or any competition, regardless of how academically bankrupt it is, will work for them.
Plus, that kind of stuff sells a lot of books, so there's always going to be somebody that rehashes it. I guess one of the ones that comes to my mind was the Da Vinci Code, which I can't remember specifically if it involved any myth postulations, kind of like what we've been talking about, but that's just something that comes to my mind. That was a very popular book that really twisted some things with regards to Christianity and did very well both in the box office and also on the New York Times bestseller list. So Let me ask you this last question before we wrap up. Let's say I'm a young person in high school or I'm in college, and I hear some of these arguments for Jesus being a copycat God, and I want to check out not just their side, but also, what do Christians say about it? What's a good argument against that? What are some good resources that as a Christian young person I could get my hands on to really look into this argument and really prepare myself for it?
I think there are some good popular level resources. You can look online. Equip.org, that's the Christian Research Institute, has got some of this stuff online on their website. There are some books that have been written. Stephen Bedard is one Christian apologist who's written one called Unmasking the Pagan Christ, and he's done a couple of other things. Websites that deal with more academic articles dealing with this. I've written a couple of articles online dealing with it, and so you can check those out. But for those who are really, really interested in refuting this idea, what I would say is look at their writings and go to the original myths. If you can find, a good library, you can find copies of these myths. Go to the myths because, just for one example, and this is not hard to find, the example of the conception of Horus. Horus is supposed to be a virgin-born god. And when you look on, and you can find this online or in a good source dealing with ancient texts, if you read the actual Egyptian account, it actually uses fairly specific language that lets you know that Isis is not a virgin when she conceives Horus. And it's not hard to see that online. There are actually pictures of the conception online. The Egyptians were not quite as guarded in depicting things of a sexual nature as we would be in the West today. And so there's actually very graphic pictures of that event that would be a little embarrassing, I'm sure, to some viewers. So, this kind of thing is one of the most blatant examples. But for those who are really, really interested in really digging in and getting into this issue, go to the original myths, and it will refute most of what the mythicists will say.
Dewayne, it's been awesome having you on the show and looking at this topic in a very specific way. What I'd like to do now is just kind of give you the last word of this segment and just go ahead and plug any events that you've got coming up, any works that you're working on, website, blog, anything and everything. Tell us what you've got going on.
What I like to do is put my work online so that I can be a help and be a benefit to other Christians. And so there's a couple of sites that I've got going on. One is my blog. It's DewayneBryant.wordpress.com. It's just called Looking at All Things Biblically. It's where I look at various issues and various things, some apologetics, some just theology, some current issues, social issues, but everything is to look at things from a biblical point of view, biblical perspective. And then the other site that I've got is my website. That's DewayneBryant.com, where I've got all the articles that I've written for various publications, a lot of them dealing with apologetics, but organized where you can kind of find your way through there. But would love to have anybody check it out to see if I can be a help to you.
Once again, want to thank Dr. Dewayne Bryant, who's a good friend of mine. He's also a writer for the Daily Apologist. And I want to thank you, the listeners, for tuning in for this episode of Dean's Dialogue in association with the Daily Apologist. And this is Dean Meadows signing off. And remember, equip yourself to engage culture.